Pause. Pause good times.
Before we start, I'd like to thank my thesis instructor, Neron Turan, secondary advisor, past 2 years, and all my friends and classmates at CED. Without your help and support, this thesis project would not have gone this far. The thesis is titled In the Two Realities. Chapter 1, The Impasses of Architecture. In the book Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo, published in 1831, the antagonist Claude Frollo directs the eyes of his visitors to the massive silhouette of the Notre Dame Cathedral beyond his door, and said, "The book will kill architecture." For 19th century Hugo, the history of architecture is the history of writing. Before the technology of printing press was born, humans communicated through and wrote upon the solid stone of architecture. With the dissemination of books, architecture reached its own impasse. Nowadays, we live in both the digital and material space simultaneously. We are always plugging various devices. When we roam through the sea of electronics, apps, social media, and games, we then experience, look at, and interact with buildings and cities in very different ways than we did in the past. We constantly look at multiple screens, ignoring the building materials surrounding us. We now navigate through the city without looking at it, while allowing the gentle sound recorded in the navigation apps to direct our path. Many, if not all, the intended architectural quality is ignored by people busy looking down at their devices. Architecture has reached its own impasse. So, as architects, we should ask, when everyone looks down at the electronic devices, how can architecture, as a physical material subject, respond to it? And what does it mean to architecture when things obtain meanings in different ways than they did before? Chapter 2, Misreading, Looking Down at Ourselves. If we take a look at the digital world, one of the most used space is the navigation apps, such as Google Maps and Google Earth. They direct us through the easiest and safest way, and provide us with the most popular destinations. Without physically traveling, we look at satellite images to understand our built environment. This thesis, then, takes Google Images as a medium, hoping to hack into the endless loop between the digital and the material. On the wall, you see 5 Google Earth images of the site of this thesis project, which is an outlet mall in Atlanta. The original and redesigned. It is one of the biggest malls in the US, covering the land space equal to 2/3 of the area of UC Berkeley campus. Its huge, flat, monolithic image floats in the sea of green and gray pixels of Google Earth. However, with the different zooms of Google Images, we can start understanding the flat, monolithic, plan building in various ways. Oftentimes, they are also misread in different resolutions of images. They are camouflaged in layers of zooms, both being inscrutable and readily apparent at the same time. This thesis is kept, this quality is kept throughout the design process. For example, the courtyards of the new outlet mall, these look like stand or dust underneath. If we zoom out a bit more, which originally they are just a stand or dust. Or we realize one of the HVAC fan is actually a spiral staircase if you zoom in enough. Chapter 3. Focus, field condition. In order to understand and define things in constantly camouflage pixel images, tracing as a pure vector design tool becomes very useful. It defines boundaries, it's easy to scale, and it expresses relationships. The tracing of the site is my own interpretation of the things we see, but we don't see. The tracing becomes the 10 species of the site, and they are released and are relocated back onto the site according to certain field conditions and based on their social needs, as they appear in the roof plan, floor plan, reflected ceiling. For example, container block, the tracing of container boxes with their shadows, is relocated to the interior of the building, becoming the storage spaces of the mall. The car lawns, tracing of the parked cars and their shadows, becomes a parking space for self-driving cars inside the mall. The legs, tracing of the street lights and the utility poles with their shadows, becomes the walls embedded with pipes and wires. The elements are being extruded down on the roof. The larger stand, tracing of the stand and dust on the roof, is turned into courtyards. Some of the smaller stands become the seating and the furniture. The lanterns, which is tracing of the mechanical boxes on the roof, are extruded below the ceiling, becoming lighting wells. In this way, we can keep the legibility or misreadability of the building from Google Images. But under the roof, instead, it's an exuberance of field objects. Composer John Page once said, "We know of two ways of unfocused attention. Symmetry is one of them. The other is overall, where each small part is a sample of what you find elsewhere." Chapter 4. No more boundary. At the end of this presentation, I'd like to again provoke the thinking of the meaning of architecture. In a world in which reality is constantly augmented through both the digital and the material. As the 1995 movie Ghost in the Shell asks at its end, with the meaning will only be obtained and retained in the sea of digital and electronics. Or there is some material quality that we can grab on. We are all cyborgs now. Jonah Haraway says in her famous Cyber Manifesto that the idea of cyber to blur the boundary between genders. It opens up different readings, understanding, and it changes our taken for granted perceptions. This thesis, by exploring the quality of misreading and unfocused field condition, wishes to open up new readings for our built environment. We then may find meanings in the superimposed layers of the two realities. The line between digital and material is destined to blur in our life. And I'd say, so is it in architecture. Thank you.
Pass around a plate for donations. Feel like a big jerk. That was good.
So if you fold the RCP model onto that's like the building. If you would take your bottom, and
It's not really floating. It's like you turn the mirror.
into a,
Yeah, so this
Yeah.
is the,
yeah.
yes.
The means, it is called.
So this is the side plan and the floor plan. Supervised.
These are portions, right?
Yeah. So in the middle, three big drone and 3 big models, only a portion of this side.
Is that more accurate?
Like that.
I have a bit of a clarification question, and maybe a bit of a sort of conceptual content question. It's somehow they're the same thing. So I can't help but think about the Eames powers of 10. Presumably you've watched that video a lot, which was produced pre-Google Earth. So your work and the kind of, especially watching this video, like I said, I can't help but think of that, but through the lens that you're trying to set up for us now, not through their lens, but just the kind of representations are similar. It seems like what you're trying to say is that the sort of ubiquity of Google Earth tied to our sort of like, you couldn't help but sort of chuckle because you were reading from your phone, as you said, like we're addicted to our phones. So there's those kinds of conflicts between like our disengagement with the world around us tied to the kind of ambiguity produced through Google Earth imaging. In that, in the zooming of Google Earth imaging, we encounter errors or misinformation or lack of information or potentially things where like the government has blurred out things we shouldn't see. And so what we take as a kind of objective view of the world that we've created in some sense is actually not a total picture. So and then you use that kind of incomplete picture in order to produce a new set of field effects. And the effect of those field effects should render us more engaged with the physical realities of our world and less so with our devices.
I don't have a strong position for the last sentence.
Okay, so then I'll
Yeah.
follow up with a question, which is, what are the intended consequences of the work?
I think the intended consequence for the work right now is more for architects to think about how we think of architecture and the design. And I think for this specific project, taking one kind of apps and saying that the material things we built is actually taken from the digital side. And after this is being built, the image is going to be taken again. And, you know, this constantly changing, becoming, joining the loop, digital material. I think it's more about awareness than something actual, concrete there for me.
I really like the investigation on. I like how precise you were with your delivery and how careful you were with it. And certainly, I think the questions that you're raising are, for me anyway, really important questions. But I want to go back to the impasse architectures in place. So, like, how do we all kind of construct that situation a little bit more intelligently? So there is the response that Clark put out there, which I don't think was his preferred position, but that the material becomes even more important as a kind of ballast against, you know, the kind of screen element, right, and the kind of virtual and right. So the architecture matters more than ever before because, you know, it's real and physical and it's material, and it ballasts or, you know, weighs us back down from the kind of ability to portal across everything. That's one position, and you said you didn't have a strong position on that. Another one would be that, like, citizens, let's say, need of architecture in cities would potentially radically change as a result of the fact that we can render ourselves as public, through multiple platforms, right? So I can make all kinds of appearances with others, some of which are, fleshy, and some of which are kind of data body oriented. And so when the public now fluctuates radically between different channels, how does architecture accommodate those bodies differently? Which doesn't have to do with like, oh, it's material because everything's getting so digital. It has to do with like where the interface, as the bodies change vis-a-vis the cyborg notion, so do the kind of collectivities, and then so do then the architectures and infrastructures that accommodate and make present the kind of ambitions and values and political situations of that collective. And I think you want to talk about your scheme in that register a little bit. So what kind of implicit invitations for collectivity are there here? What do we do when we arrive here? How do we arrive? Do we need to be oriented? I mean, if it's the size of Berkeley campus, or would you say 3/4 of the size?
2/3.
2/3. So this is an enormous interior condition. Do we arrive? Like here we are, or do we approach this thing with anticipation and some kind of watered down pilgrimage idea about arrival? How does it anticipate these bodies? Is this a library are these programmatic bits?
This one?
Yeah.
It's a storage space.
Storage.
So if we talk about arrival, I think the self-driving car becomes so popular in so we just simply park in the mall. So there are parking spaces for
Why do we park?
No, so you get out of the car and the car just get out. So and then it's
we
like
keep
park.
going.
Yeah. And the Nestor doesn't need roads because you recognize objects. But there are.
I'm a little curious in terms of when you were kind of bracketing this thing. You always stay purely in the top view, and probably 5 years ago, 10 years ago, people they thought, oh yeah, we're going to always have just that Google Earth view, and then suddenly Street View pops up, and then suddenly we start to get actual interiors in these things as well. And I guess I wonder, I'm very curious about what maybe that offers us as architects as well. And so I don't know if there's a specific reason why you said, okay, no, I'm not entering into that. I always want to stay in the top view, but it seems like increasingly the top view thing it's kind of going away, and it's becoming even more three-dimensional than it has.
Okay, but let's just put that in the category of the impassive architecture, is that where it's a discipline that works organizationally, and experientially. But the experience is often either hyper realistic in its representation, which we haven't seen that really at all this last couple of days, or abstract. But the plan is still a kind of a unit of operation, right? So it's part of the impasse is that the plan would get pressurized as like where the action is, and so the plan. This is a fixation on a kind of not an extrusion from the plan up, but from the roof down, which is kind of interesting. But it's still a plan, thinking and planning.
But the plan of the mall is a very different plan than the plan of other things. In terms of when we think about the kind of cartoon diagram plans that we see situated in those spaces, those environments. I mean, that's where when I look at this thing, I'm like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting that it's not actually rendered in the kind of way that I know that Google Earth would render a map. but it actually starts to have like the kind of purple zones, and so you start to get kind of zones through coloration.
There's a missing part of the conversation, maybe I'm way off track here, but aren't you intentionally misreading things? So there's a kind of a
Yeah. Yes.
transformation, translation of images to other imagined environments.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so the project I want to give you is, why does it stop? Like, why, when you get to here, why is it now fixed? Why don't you, you made me think of this with the street view thing. Why, when you move in on that again, does it not transform into some other series of misreadings that are just as rich as your initial, this means that? I'm a little suspicious of the equal sign in your translation. That skylight means this, street light means this. So I'm wondering, we're going to start a new program that's called Do It Over Again. It won't take 3 years, maybe only 2 years. And we'll give you another 20 feet here. But I just wonder why it so quickly stopped for you. Like, I mean, it's an extraordinary project, and I'm a believer. If I had $1, I would put it in the collection place. But so I'm just worried a little bit about that quick translation and then fixed again. Like, it seems like it should always be malleable, and this thing keeps in my right eye the whole time, so I keep waiting for it to change into another reading. And
But I think that's really extremely powerful. I mean, again, phenomenal work, and the delivery of this is so compelling. Like, often, when people are reading a statement, distance, but you really have us the whole time, and I think it was really fabulous. And I think this shift between where suddenly the ventilator fan becomes the spiral staircase, it changes the scale at which this operates. So then I was surprised when you said it's still a mall, or maybe it's still a mall, but it's like much smaller than the original mall, or much faster, or depending on how those misreadings occur, like the scale of my body vis-a-vis these elements of these spaces changes radically. So maybe at some point humans don't even fit in here anymore. And that, I think, is really a fascinating possibility. Like, and when you said you misread the car park with its shadow, and then that somehow again gets recycled into this space where the driverless cars will exist. And I think those, I would love to hear more. I'd love there to be a whole catalog of those moments where it starts to, architecture, what is its role in? Does it suddenly become space for non-human actors? I do think that sort of infinite recycling could be staged. I mean, maybe the video is the place to do that. Where you said that, you suggested that now this would again be photographed, it'd be captured, and it'd be sort of misread by someone else. I think. Is that? I mean, that's why I'm surprised too. You didn't photograph it and then insert it into a Google Earth. And it is somebody brought up the hyper-real versus the abstraction. This might be a project that could really take on the hyper-real rendition. I don't know how many people.
Some shadowy core, which he says has to do with enigma, doubt, and uncertainty, not rationality. That rationality is a huge defensive infrastructure that the institution has produced in order to make it seem like this is valid. So, like, what are the consequences here of like delamination of like spatial experience and time, for example, which is in the images that you show, right, of being surrounded by, lying on the bed looking at the phone, surrounded by a very different kind of image-scape. And like there's a kind of, delamination of the body and of its different registers of experience, right? So my ability to interact with this remotely would change what I would demand of it when I arrive, not digitally, but in the flesh, right? So where I think that to me is the next level of the thinking in the project, is to kind of get down to some radical consequences of the very thing that you're looking at. and play them out architecturally. I think that's the beauty of what you set up with this kind of moment of impasse. So you have the cathedral, you have the book, you have, I don't know what we're going to say next, the screen, and then now we've got the cathedral again, but it's not a cathedral anymore. It's a kind of horizontal field, blurry at its edges, immensely proportioned. It wasn't a mall though, was it? It's more probably a distribution building. And now it's been kind of re-engaged, you know, with cyborgian bodies, disaggregated publics, like messy relationships, right? Like I can hit a button and change the temperature in my living room in Knoxville. That's crazy.
Definitely has.
Right. You know, so that's a way in which I can be there and here, right? Because I'll get a text like, you know, why did you make it 80 degrees in here? You know, like, and then all of a sudden, like, the kind of temporal score of my presence here is completely transformed. And I think, I mean, I don't know, like, I'm just fascinated by that in the way that you are. But I would hold out for like some speculation on your part, and maybe it's there, that has more to do with those kinds of bodies and publics, like coming together at a place like this. Not as a solution, not as a resolution of all of these forces, but as part of the politics of the impasse.
I think that there's a chapter 5, was it the 4? Chapter 4? And I think that it's all obviously up to you after this discussion what that chapter is, but I know that it's something about, again, a group of either experience or publics that is need going inside of this, so that there is that kind of, almost like you have to span the understanding of this thing. But I have to say that throughout the semester, I'm actually happy that you focus, because in this world, it's in this kind of a topic, it's easy to go. And I think that I'm happy that you're actually focused to that kind of zoom back and forth, just a flat version. But there is a chapter 5, and
We look forward to
you
it.
want to see it, yeah.
Speaking of 5, you're missing 5 columns. Which now I just realized like maybe that's part of your trick. Like that's my misreading. Like
Could be. That's good. You got it. That's excellent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We're going upstairs to the last project that is in front of the Department of Architecture, second floor, where we have lunch.